everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I am sharing on my blog this free sub sandwich felt food pattern. And in today's video, I want to walk you through the pattern, explain a few of the pieces to you, show you how to make them. So let's get started. Let's first start and look at the pattern itself. This is a larger pattern. You're going to get a lot of pieces in here. So first is the title page. That's pretty self-explanatory. But then the next page is the shopping list. On this shopping list, you are going to find everything that you will need to create this felt food set. If you've done any hand sewing or anything like that beforehand, or you have a sewing kit, you probably have a lot of these items already on hand. But what is really useful in this little list right here are the felt colors and the floss colors you will need to match the felt colors. So I have those all listed, everything you're going to need to create the food you see here. And if you are wondering, if you are new to this, the felt color is the name on the back of the felt sheet on your little price tag. Also, the majority of my felt is bought from Michaels. So when you see a color like Purple Pizzazz, that is the color name that you can find at Michaels. You can order their felt online or you can go to the store. If you prefer a different store, just color match as best you can, or if you want to buy a higher end wool felt, color match as best you can online. Next up is the floss colors. The little number is right on the package. It corresponds to what's on the shopping list. I use floss because it's cheap and it's really strong and holds up really well to little hands. And it comes in so many different colors. You can color match it to the felt really well. I like to store mine on these little plastic bobbin cards. So after the shopping list, we're going to get into the bulk of the pattern. And I went ahead and included some pictures in with this pattern. I included the one with all the components together, and then I also included individual pictures of each section of the pattern. That it just makes it a little bit easier if you like sewing on the go. You always have a reference to go back to. So next up is the cheese and condiment portion of the pattern, the actual pattern itself. These are the pieces you're going to cut out and use as your guide. Next up is the bread pattern. You have the pictures and the pattern itself, of course. Easy to follow. Next up is the meatball and sauce. I also included a nice close-up to the back of the meatball so you could kind of remember how I went about making these. Really easy to go back and reference those photos. Then you have the meats, and you also have the toppings pictures and the patterns to follow. So you have those meats right there. And then the next page, the final page, is the toppings. This is by far the most in-depth, kind of time-consuming, the toppings, so I left that one last. All right, now let's go ahead and I'm going to show you how I make some of these pieces and talk you through some of them. Let's start with the bread. Of course, with any of these pieces, you first want to start off by cutting out your pattern. These are really simple to follow. I have written instructions on each one. Now, when I was making this pattern, I didn't have the exact felt colors and I wasn't going to go back and rework all these patterns. So when you see things like tan or ivory, ivory is antique white, tan is the cashmere tan. It just kind of corresponds. I use just regular color names instead of specific color names as I was creating these patterns because, like I said, I made the patterns before I knew the exact felt colors. Now you'll also see some detailed instructions on some of these pieces, like you're going to cut out each one of those sections, and that is to create some slits, kind of baking slits for your bun. And then also you'll see like you need to cut some pieces out from chipboard, but I'll walk you through all that. So each one of these slits I am going to cut out by simply folding the paper in half and making a little opening and then removing each one of those pieces. This is a little extra step that I like to do to make my bun look more realistic. If this is something that you don't want to take the time to do, don't do it. Just simply sew the two pieces together. The great thing about felt food, and specifically this pattern, you can make it your own. You don't have to follow exactly how I have done it. You can make it work for your skill level, for the time that you may have, whatever. Make it work for you. And in this pattern, I have this piece also. This is the top and bottom inside. I simply did that in case you want to cut them out separately, but they are exactly the same shape. The top and bottom bun and the inside, exactly the same shape. I only bother cutting out one and using one. That way everything matches up well. But if you like to do bulk cutting and then kind of pin everything down and then cut, I went ahead and included two. But again, I'm just going to use this one piece here. Also, whenever I am creating my pieces to sew together, the majority of the time I have two pieces of felt that I am sewing together, whether they are the same color, whether they are different colors, like in this case. When they need to match up exactly, I cut them together. Felt is a little difficult to cut. It just can be a little wonky and give your scissors a hard time. How to get around this is, first of all, to make sure you have a really good sharp pair of scissors that you are using. Don't try and use your kids' old school scissors or anything like that. Use some really sharp scissors. I would suggest having a broad pair of scissors and also having a fine detail scissors to use in some of those tighter places. Now, once I have those two pieces cut, I am going to go ahead and take this cashmere tan top and some tailor's chalk, and I am just going to mark out those slits. I like to draw in the slits here and then cut them out. That just gives me a little bit more control than trying to work around the paper itself, because felt is harder to cut. And I like using tailor's chalk, especially on this piece, because it's going to come out. All I have to do is brush it away with my fingers or a damp wipe. If you don't have tailor's chalk, you can use regular chalk. It's a little bit more denser than a regular chalk, but it's going to work in exactly the same way. And then if you don't have any of that, just use a Sharpie or a pen and flip it over to the back and make your marks on the back. Just make sure it's not something that's going to bleed through fully to the front. Again, all these things I'm using here can easily be replaced or substituted. This is not the end all be all of how you need to do this. Make it work for you. Once I have those marked out, I will just use my scissors and cut out each one of those little slits from the top of the bun. Again, this is just an extra step I like to take to make it look a little bit more realistic. If you don't want to take the time, just sew the two pieces together. Once I have all of those cut out, it should match up perfectly since I went ahead and cut these out together, and my top is just about ready to go. But while I am cutting out pieces, I like to just get them all done at once, have them ready to go. I find when I am doing large patterns like this, I like to just get it all done in one go. So if I am cutting felt, I'm going to get a bunch of it done at once. And then when I have it all cut, I'll just put it into a little baggie. Even smaller baggies, like some of the more intricate pieces, I'll just kind of individualize into smaller baggies and pop them into a bigger baggie. Then I can just take that with me on the go, and I can sew in the car if I'm sitting at a practice for a kid or whatever it may be. I've got my little pieces ready to go, and I can just pull out a baggie from my bag. Next up, I am going to cut out each one of these little pieces of felt to put into those slit openings. This again is from the antique white color. The bun is the cashmere tan and antique white. Those are the really only two colors you're going to be using on the bun. So if you want to start with that, those are the only colors you will need at first. And with some of these smaller pieces, like you've seen, I don't even bother pinning them down, especially ones that don't need to fit perfectly, like that opening or fill in for the opening of the slit. Now next on this piece, you will need two pieces of chipboard. Don't go buy any chipboard special. Use some old packaging. I'm using an old cereal box. This is nice and sturdy, sturdy enough for what I need it. The only thing I will say is this has a very bright pattern on one side, but I'll show you how to work around that shortly. With some of these pieces that are going to go on the inside for stability, that's what this chipboard is for stability and a flat surface. You don't want them to fully extend to the edges of the other pieces. And I'm using a ruler here just to show you how far I'm going in, but for the most part, I just eyeball it and cut around. But you want to come in about 1/4 of an inch from the pattern itself and just cut along that 1/4 of an inch. So kind of like an inseam. You just want to kind of come in a little bit so that way it leaves room for your stitching. Once I have those lines marked, again, I would normally just eyeball this. I'm going to go ahead and cut right inside those lines. Just come in 1/4 of an inch and make my cut. You don't want to try and shove your needle through chipboard. You'll get frustrated and you'll quit. Trust me, it's not going to work, or it will work. It's just not going to be easy. So just come in 1/4 of an inch, cut out your 2 chipboard pieces. So here's a look at what you should have to create the top and bottom bun for the sub sandwich. You should have your 2 chipboard pieces cut in 1/4 of an inch. You should have your top bun with the slits cut out in the tan. You should have your 3 opening pieces. And then you should also have your tan and your antique white for the bottom bun. Pretty simple and straightforward. Now it's going to be time to start sewing it all together. Now for the bun, you're only going to be using 2 different colors of floss. You're going to be using 487 and you're also going to be using ecru. I'm going to start off with this 487 and I'm going to first pull apart my strands. So when you get floss, I get the 6-strand embroidery floss. As I am sewing, I do not need all 6 strands. It would be way too bulky. So what I like to do is separate it out. You get more use out of it that way, and it just makes for easier sewing. You're still going to get the stability and the longevity out of this that you need, but it's just not going to be as bulky. To separate it, I simply kind of pull it down on itself using my fingernails. And the number of threads I separate it to depends on what I'm working on. So for something like this bun in the pattern, this is one of the main pieces. This is something that's going to be used every single time you need the bun. So I'm going to go with 3 strands. If it's something like a smaller piece or something that's not going to be handled as much or that's flatter, I will just use 2 strands. That's going to be plenty. That's going to give you plenty of strength to hold that together. But as for the bun, you're going to be adding stuffing. You're going to be using and handling this a lot. So go for 3 strands. That's kind of how I make my determination of how many strands I want to use on certain pieces. So to start off with, we're going to fill in each one of those openings with the little kind of leaf shapes that we made from the antique white. And all I'm going to be using is a whip stitch and just simply whip stitch that right into place from the back. You of course want to put that in the back and whip stitch it through those openings. Throughout this pattern, the only stitches I will be using are a whip stitch, a running stitch, and for the most part, a blanket stitch. Maybe a back stitch here and there, but if you can just get those stitches down, you can do this. I am not going to show you how to do them because I am a novice sewer. I don't know them, and I'm probably not even doing them right myself. If you want to know how to do them correctly, I suggest you go and find somebody that is better educated on it than I am and watch some of their videos. There are plenty of great ones out there and better teachers than I am. So just look up whip stitch, back stitch, running stitch, and blanket stitch. That blanket stitch is going to be the one that we use the most along with the whip stitch like I'm using here just to pin this in place. Now I went ahead and just used my floss to go around and whip stitch that right into place. You'll also notice as I am doing this, these pieces are a little bit big. I made these purposely a little bit big to go in the back That way you have a little bit of wiggle room. I hate it when I get something in a pattern and it fits just perfectly. I have no wiggle room. So these are made specifically a little bit big because sometimes this can be a little bit finicky and it can move around on you as you're sewing it into place. This way, you've got that little bit of wiggle room. You're not going to screw it up. But whenever you're done, if it's gone to one side or it's gone to the other a little bit too much, use your scissors and trim it down. It's really simple to fix it that way, to trim off any excess rather than to not have enough. So yes, I know it's a little big to fit into that opening. I know it hangs over the sides a little bit. It is specifically designed that way so you have that wiggle room and you can just trim it up later. All right, I went ahead, whip stitched around each one. I did not start and stop my floss between each one. I suggest you do, but I am lazy and I do not like to do that. So I just went ahead and created kind of a running whip stitch, if you will, and just move my floss over. You can see if you do that, just make sure you're laying it flat as you do it so you don't bunch up your felt at all. And then once I have it all stitched into place, I'm just going to create a little knot and snip off my thread. It's ready to go. Now you can see my last two I still haven't trimmed up. They're hanging over a little bit. That's fine. I'm just going to trim them down with my scissors and make sure that none will be hanging out as I go to sew my two pieces together. You just want to be sure that you're not going to cut through any threads, so just stay far away. You don't need to cut off much here. Just a little snip here and there to make sure that it's not going to hang out the side. No big deal. You also want to trim up any little excess string so that way it is not hanging out the side either. And again, just a nice little snip here and there, and it should be just fine. All right, it's time to sew the two pieces together. And you also want to sew them with your little piece of chipboard right in the center. Now, if you use some old packaging like I did, you might have one brightly colored side and one nice brown side. If that is the case, make sure that your pattern side is facing up and your plain side is facing towards the antique white. That way, when you go and you flip this over, you don't have some bright orange peeking through that felt or whatever color you may have. So just make sure that that is facing up. You're going to be stuffing this with some fiber fill anyway, so it's going to cover up that pattern. It won't matter as long as it's on the top. To keep that piece of chipboard in place while I am sewing, I like to use a little bit of adhesive. I used removable adhesive here. You can use a little bit of Scotch tape if that's what you have. You can pin it in place if that's what you want to do. It really is up to you. I just like to use a little something to hold it in place so I'm not fighting it the whole time I'm blanket stitching around it. But I do like it to be in place. That way, as I'm stitching, I know how far I kind of want my stitches to go in, and I'm not fighting it later on. So I blanket stitch almost around the whole thing. I leave the top open, and then I'm going to stuff it with this polyfill. This is included in the supply list. It is simply a little stuffing material. I use a chopstick to stuff mine right inside. Now, unfortunately, the video I have of this did get corrupted, so I'm going to talk you through it. I use a wooden chopstick. That way it has a little tooth and it can grab that fiber fill, and I just stuff it down into the bun itself. Then, when I've got it most of the way full up to the top, I'll go ahead and close up the opening that I used to stuff it, almost closed, and then I'll stuff just a little bit more in there to fill in that opening gap as well. I like to leave a larger opening at first. That way I don't stretch out the felt. Once this felt is stretched out, it's not going back. So leave a larger opening, do the majority of your stuffing, close it up the majority of the way, stuff your little bit right into where it needs it, and then just close it up and tie it off, and you're ready to go. The bottom bun is made exactly the same way. You just don't have to worry about the slits. But again, you're just going to do the top and the bottom blanket stitched together with some chipboard in there and stuff it up. Really, really simple and easy to do. Let's move on to the cheese and condiments portion of the pattern. Here's a look at all the components. I'm going to walk you through the majority of these. I'll show you a few, but for the most part, these are some really, really simple pieces to put together and quick. So, like I said, you have the pattern, and I like to just cut it out. It kind of depends on where I'm working. If I know I'm going to be doing the majority of this while I'm out and about, I'll cut them all at once and keep these pieces in a baggie. If I'm just working at my desk, I'll cut them out one by one. Kind of just depends. But I cut out my pieces here, and then I'm going to cut them out from my felt. So I have my ketchup here. I'm going to stitch two pieces together for this just to give it a little bit more heft and just a little bit cuter, I think, with the stitches. So whenever I'm cutting out two pieces and stitching them together, I like to cut them out at once, like I said. That way the cut lines match up exactly if I mess something up. So I just fold my felt in half and then I will cut it out with my scissors. This is one of those times, especially with these thin, intricate pieces, where you want your really sharp scissors or you will go crazy, I promise. And as I am doing this and you are watching, I do want to stress, yes, I cut these out and I sew two pieces together. That is for longevity and for making this cheaper felt a little bit more durable, so it's going to last a little bit longer. If you do not want to put in the time and effort of that, you don't need to do it. Just cut out the pieces. Your kids are going to be just as happy with one piece. You don't need to stitch them together if that's too much time. I get it. We all don't have the same amount of time to do this with. That's cool. Just cut out the pieces, put them in a baggie for your kids. They'll love it just as much. You don't need to take this extra step. And felt is cheap. You can always cut out more if one piece gets ruined. All I did with each one of these, though, was cut out my two pieces and stitch them together with a blanket stitch. Also, I did ketchup, mayonnaise, and mustard. Those are kind of the normal ones that we see around where I live. If you have a special sauce that your kids like, color match it to that sauce and use the pattern for it. It really is very easy to customize this to what you and your family need and want. Same thing with the cheeses. These are squares and circles, very simple shapes. Use the pattern and create any special cheese you may want. I did an American, a Swiss, and a provolone. For the American, I actually used gold felt. I did not use yellow. I know it says yellow on the pattern. I used gold. That is the color name at Michael's. I feel like it just gives it a little bit more depth. It's a little bit darker of a color and it's not that bright, bold, fakey yellow, kind of like the mustard is. So that is what I used. And then the floss colors and the felt colors, as I'm talking, I will leave down below just in case I don't get to them. So moving on to each one of these pieces of cheese. All it is two pieces cut out from the pattern and then blanket stitched around the edges. The only one that is a little different is the Swiss cheese that has the openings in it. And I did blanket stitch around each one of those openings. You can always just blanket stitch around the edge and use a little bit of glue in between the two pieces to hold it together. I just did the stitching for, again, longevity of the pieces. And then, of course, you have the provolone, which is made the exact same way, antique white, blanket stitched around the edge. For each one of these cheese pieces, I also did two of them. It just fits a little bit better on the bun. If you're out of time or you don't want to take the time to do that, just do one of each one. I just like the look of two. Or you can do more, of course, completely customizable. Let's move on to the meatballs and sauce. These are a little bit different, a little bit more, not necessarily harder, but just a little bit more needlework to get these put together. But again, pretty simple. So first you're going to start off with your pattern. You have your sauce, of course, and you have your meatball, and you also have what is the bottom of the meatball. So for each one of these, you are going to only cut out one. You're not going to stitch together two pieces here because we're going to be stuffing these with some of that fiber fill. So I'll cut out my large and small circle from walnut brown. And I've got my floss. I'm using the 3371 floss here. And on my larger brown circle, I am going to do a running stitch just around the perimeter. You don't want to go too far in here or you'll have a little leftover bit on the top when you cinch this together. But you want to go pretty close to the edge, but be careful because sometimes this felt on the edges can get a little wonky or it can kind of separate a little bit. So just a happy medium, maybe like a 16th of the way in from the edge, come in and do a running stitch. A running stitch is simply down the front, back up the back. You're not going to create solid stitched lines all the way through. And that is going to end up giving you the ability to pull one side of this thread and cinch it together. So you're going to make that running stitch all the way around the edge, and then we are going to take our fiber fill. This is a nice big bag of it. The stuff is fairly cheap. You can buy it at your local craft store. You're going to take a little piece of that. I like to kind of roll it into a ball just to get it shaped how I want it first. And then I'm just going to put it right in the middle. Now this can get a little finicky to kind of hold everything together and make sure everything's stuffed in its place. But once you have that fiber fill in the center, you're going to start pulling your thread closed. And you just want to continue to kind of stuff and pull. Stuff and pull. You'll kind of push that fiber right down into the meatball and kind of poke it all into all those crevices and openings and just pull that closed. Now, on my previous meatballs, I have tried to put my circle inside the meatball and then close it up. That is really difficult and it's so time consuming. What I suggest doing instead is what I'm doing here, which is pull it closed and add a few stitches from one side to the next, kind of like you're making an X. You can even do multiples of these, and that is going to kind of close that up as much as you want your meatball closed and just give you that extra set of hands, kind of that tension on the meatball to keep it closed. That way you're not fighting it the entire time. So put a few of those stitches in and pull that thread nice and tight. This is another one of those times I suggest using either 2 or 3 pieces of your floss. That's going to give you enough where you can pull on this a good amount and it's not going to break those threads. Once I have those stitches in, I'm going to take my smaller circle and I'm going to whip stitch that right into place on the back to cover up that opening. You just want to get your needle in there. You can start from the back, you can start from the top, whatever is easiest for you. And then just whip stitch it right to the bottom of that meatball to hold it in place, cover up your opening, cover up your fiber fill, and finish off your meatball. This is also going to give you a nice base for them to sit on as you're creating your little sandwiches. And for my sandwiches, I like to do 3 meatballs, or for my set, I did 3 meatballs. You can do more, you can do less. It really is up to you. Now next we're going to do the marinara sauce. This one has a little bit of a special instruction and I'll walk you through it. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and cut out 2 pieces of red felt. For this one, if you want the moldability of the marinara sauce, you are going to need to sew 2 pieces together. And like I said before, whenever I'm doing that, I want all of my pieces to line up. Sometimes cuts on felt can be a little wonky, so I like to do them both at the same time. You'll also see on this one, it says to cut 2 pieces from foil. That is regular kitchen foil. The foil I had on hand was it was the off-brand. It was not sturdy, so I actually doubled up and did 4 pieces. Just kind of play it by ear, see what works best for you, and use your best judgment. I use a Sharpie to outline this because just like the chipboard, we're going to need to come in closer, especially with foil. You don't want any of this sticking out the edge with little fingers. It can cut, so just make sure that you go in about 1/4 of an inch when you're cutting this out. So like I said, I like to go ahead and do mine all at once. I use a Sharpie to outline it. Then I am just going to, you can either cut along the lines first and then come in and cut in 1/4 of an inch. You can use your ruler if you want to be really specific, or you can just eyeball it and cut out 1/4 of an inch, just the best you can. You just want to make sure that you come in enough to make space for stitching and enough where this is not going to come out of the stitching or overhang the stitching. You just want to make sure this is all covered up when you're done. So I'll finish that up and then just check it. If any places need a little touch up, you can always come back in and cut them a little bit closer or take a little bit more off, if you will. So I'll line that up, make sure I am happy with the seam allowance I have given myself. And if not, I'll just come in, a little bit needed to be taken off that top right corner. So I'll just take that off and then double check it, make sure I've got a good allowance of where I can do my stitches. This is not going to be as hard to get through as your chipboard. It actually would probably be beneficial to your needle, but you don't want any of that in the stitching, just because first of all it could cut your stitches, second of all it can cut your kids. So just come in nice and close. Then I'll pin that all into place and stitch around the entire perimeter with a blanket stitch with that 321 floss that matches the red felt. What this foil is going to do is it is going to give you moldability. So you are going to be able to make this kind of into any shape you want. So I absolutely love this for the marinara sauce because it holds those meatballs into place. You can kind of drape it over. It gives that drapey look, and it also gives some stability so your meatballs will stay in place. And it has 3 little kind of curves, and those are for your 3 meatballs, so it just kind of closes around them. And then I added some provolone cheese to the top, kind of use my hands to smush it all together, and that will hold it in place with that foil inside the marinara sauce. And there you have a lovely meatball sandwich. I adore these. I think they're so adorable. And it just makes a really cute little sandwich. Okay, let's move on to the meats. These are really simple, but there are a few things I want to go over with you. So first of all, the meats that I chose to do were ham, turkey, pepperoni, bologna, and olive loaf. If there are any specific meats that your kiddo likes or that your family often has on a sub sandwich, I included some pretty basic shapes so you can create those as best as you can with different colors of felt. Now let's start off with taking a look at all of these different pieces. So I have the ham first of all, and in the pattern each one is listed as how much it takes to make one piece of each of these. Now if you want to make one piece, that's totally cool. I like to make 3. I think it looks nice layered up, but you could by all means get away with 2. I just like the look of 3 better. I like to kind of make them a little bit more diagonal, but 2 works just as well if you want to save yourself some time. So for the ham, the turkey, and the olive loaf, I made 3 of each of those. The ham and the olive loaf are pretty much the same shape, and the turkey is just kind of a football shape. So pretty easy and simple to do. Next up, we have the bologna. For the bologna, I did 3 pieces. I would suggest you do 3 pieces because I think that looks the best. You could get away with 2, but these are a little bit smaller, so I think 3 is a good amount. The pepperoni, I did 4 of these. I like to overlap a little bit, and I think it just looks better with 4 for my taste, but 3 will absolutely do. You could even do 2 and get away with it. Now for each one, I simply cut out the 2 sides and blanket stitch them together. The ham is made with baby pink felt, and for the floss color, I used 151. Pretty simple and self-explanatory, just 2 pieces cut out, blanket stitched together. And by all means, you can just do 1 and cut it out. You don't have to stitch 2 together if you don't want to. Pepperoni is red felt and 321 floss. Again, cut out, 2 pieces, blanket stitched together around the edge. Very, very simple and easy to do. Again, I made 4 of those. The turkey. I used sandstone felt for this. However, if you don't like the look of that, or if you're like, well, I'm already buying antique white, that will go too for the turkey. You can absolutely use that, but I like the look of sandstone just because it gives a different color in this when you're making the different sandwiches, or your kiddo is, because the cheese and the bun both use antique white. So I just like the little bit of different colors. Also, for the stitching around the edge, I did not color match. I used a little bit darker of a thread. Now, what I used is 975. However, I did not include that in the supply list. I actually included 3371, I believe is what it is, the darker brown, just because you're going to use that already on the meatball. I didn't think you needed to buy one specific floss color for just the edges of the turkey when you already had a dark brown you could use. So use your best judgment, buy it if you want, use the dark brown that's included in the supply list if you want. Bologna, same thing. I did baby pink, but I did red for the stitching around the edges. I just thought it gave it a little bit more of a bologna look. You kind of know what it is that way with that red edge. The olive loaf is the only one that is a little bit more time consuming. So for each olive loaf, I do 2 sides. So I do 2 pieces. And on those 2 pieces, I stitch some olives using green and red felt. And to put those on, I just use a whip stitch. Now on the pattern, I did include the green and the red pimentos. So the green olives, the red pimentos. However, that was just for reminders, or if you're not comfortable, absolutely use the pattern to cut those out. But what I find easiest is just using my little scraps of felt and cutting them freehand. That way each one is a little bit different. All you need to do is take the tiniest piece of scrap, especially for those pimentos. It's a great way to use up your scraps, and just cut a wonky kind of oval or circle shape, and you're ready to go. It's really that simple. I don't think you need to use the pattern for those pieces, but I did include them just in case you wanted to use them, and also as a reminder to, hey, cut me out, I belong on these pieces. Now for each olive loaf, I did 2 greens and 3 reds on one side, and then on the other side, I did 1 green and the 3 reds. That gives you a better look looking at the 2 opposite sides, just kind of to mix it up a little bit. And each piece is blanket stitched together on the edges. I used baby pink, apple green, and red for the felt colors, and there are the floss colors listed down below to match the respective felt colors. Very simple and easy to do. Stitch those olives on first with a whip stitch, and then blanket stitch the 2 pieces together. Pretty simple. Now let's move on to the toppings. These are by far the most time consuming pieces, especially because you need a few of each piece. Again, that's something I chose to do. You definitely don't have to make a few of each piece. I just think it makes the set a little bit more fun. So let's start off with the easiest, and that is olives. I'm using black here because that's what my family enjoys, are black olives, but if you wanted to do a green olive, you could. I just wouldn't cut out the center, and I would just either glue or stitch a small piece of red right on the center. But I like to just do a black olive. I freehand it most of the time. You can use the pattern that is included, cut out a circle, and then simply cut out the center of the circle. With this one, I do not stitch 2 pieces together. I think it's so small. You've got to make a ton of these. I find it too time consuming for me, so I just leave this as is. And I cut about 10 to 15 of them. It takes no time at all. If you did want to stitch them together, just make sure that you pick up the 310 floss. I did include that in the supply list, and I made a little note that you only need that if you're stitching olives together. Now next up we will do the lettuce. This is fairly simple. It's just a little time consuming with the stitching. Now the first thing you want to do obviously is cut out your pattern. and then stick it on your apple green felt and then cut out 2 pieces. Now, a lot of these toppings do have detail work. I will say that I like to do the majority of my detail work in stitching with the floss. However, if you don't want to do that, and again, it is time consuming if that's not your thing, use fabric paint. It is a great way to add some texture and some details to these pieces without being totally time consuming. So as you're watching me create this lettuce, just know that as I'm doing the detail stitching, you can totally do that with fabric paint and it will look just as adorable. I'll show you later on in the video with another one of the topping pieces how I did that. Now for the lettuce, I simply start off by blanket stitching the 2 pieces of felt together. Again, totally optional. Just cut out a piece of lettuce if you want to and don't stitch it together. That's fine too. But whenever you are doing stitching like this, and you're going to do the detail stitching, you want to make sure that you start in the bottom center of the lettuce leaf. Because as I'm doing my detail stitching, I'm going to start right in the bottom center to create those leaf lines. Now, I am quite lazy, I guess you could say. I don't love to start and stop floss. I hate it actually. So I like to start and stop where I know I want to begin again, if that makes any sense. So I don't need to start and stop floss a million times. I like to do as many stitches as I can with that one piece without starting and stopping it. So as I am doing this, no, there's probably an easier way. I just don't want to start and stop floss. So I am going to start off with a running stitch right up the center. And then when I get to about that first kind of curve of the leaf, I'm going to start branching off with another running stitch right up to the side of that leaf. Then once I get to kind of the side, the top, and I can't do any more of the running stitch, I'm going to come back and back stitch through the open spaces just to fill in the gaps. And that way I will end up right back in the center. So here you can see I'm just kind of pushing through the top, pulling through the back. So in one side, out the other, in one side, out the other. Very, very simple and easy to do. Once I get to that far side and I don't want to go any further, I am going to go right back down through the open spaces. So I'll come back down this way, make sure I come through the hole that I've previously made, and then go right back through where I made that other hole. Right back to where I started, working my way back down. And once I make it back to the center, I am going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the opposite side. And because with any leaf you have the 2 veins that kind of go out from each other, I want to make this as close to my first line as possible. So I will just kind of use that as a reference guide and go right up and do the exact same thing on the opposite side. But by doing it this way, you can make your way up and then come right back down to the center and continue your stitching. You don't have to start and stop your thread at all by doing it this way. Once I get back to the center, I'm going to go ahead and do a running stitch right up to the next place where I want to vein off 2 little pieces. And I'm kind of using those curves that are in the lettuce leaf as a guide of where to vein off. And as I go up the center, I am making sure to just do a running stitch at this point. I will come back and fill that in as I make my way back down. So I went ahead and just went up the center with that running stitch, did a couple more kind of veins off from the center there, exactly the same way I did the first ones. Then once I make it to the top, I'm just going to come back down with my thread. That way I can start and stop and have less thread showing all the way around the piece of lettuce. So if I started at the bottom and I've already got a little tail maybe hanging out, one more isn't going to be that much of a distraction, but it just kind of helps contain all the mess as well. Once I get back to the bottom, I will just make a little knot by simply making a blanket stitch essentially and then pulling it tight and cutting it off. And there you have it, a lettuce leaf. For these, I did 2 of them. And next up, we're going to do the cucumber. Now, the cucumber, the pickle, the onion, and the tomato are pretty much sewn in the same way. They are not the same, but they are sewn in the same way. So I'm only going to show you one, and then I'll walk you through the steps of the others. For the cucumber, you are going to use white, antique white, and Kelly green for the side. You need 2 white circles for the kind of meat of the cucumber. You need 6 little seeds of antique white for the seeds. And then you need 1 Kelly green for the side or the skin of the cucumber. For the seeds, these are very small. I'm going to whip stitch them on, but I'm going to use a little Fabri-Tac to hold them down first. These can get a little finicky to whip stitch on. By all means, if you just want to glue them down, that's fine too. And don't bother stitching them on. This Fabri-Tac is really strong glue. It's going to hold everything in place. Pretty hard to get that separated once you have it glued down, so you should be good. But I am going to whip stitch mine into place just because I like the look again. If you feel like this is too much work, either simply glue it down with Fabri-Tac or felt glue, or again, you can use fabric paint and just glue it down or make some little seeds on there with fabric paint. That would be adorable too. For the center of this, I want to add a little fluff. I am going to use some batting and cut out a circle from that I did for the meat of the cucumber. Now this is going to have to fit inside, so I did the circle just like it's included in the pattern. Then I am going to come in and cut about 1/8 of an inch from the side all the way around, just to create a little bit smaller of a circle so it will just sit nicely right inside. I am using 1 piece of batting. If you want it a little bit thicker, you can by all means use 2. Some of these pieces I did use 2, others I used 1. Just use your best judgment. If batting is not something you want to buy and invest in, it's fairly cheap, but it's just another thing to add to the list. If you don't want to do that, just use some felt right in the center and cut out some extra pieces. Felt is cheap. You can buy just some white pieces of felt and use that as your batting too. You just will need to cut a few more pieces to get that nice bulk inside. Okay, so once I have the seed stitched down, it's time to start stitching this thing together. I'm going to be using the dark green floss for this, and I'm going to start off by kind of tying it on to the edge of the green side. Then I am going to start using a blanket stitch to stitch the side and the meat of the cucumber together. You want to make sure that you are going through the top and the outer portion of the skin. So the top of the cucumber and the outer portion of the skin, and blanket stitch those together. You want to keep them fairly close to the edge and just sew those together with a blanket stitch. You can kind of see what I'm doing better in the video than I can explain it. This just makes sure that the 2 pieces stay together, but they also lay correctly. You don't want to go through the outer side of the cucumber and then through the inside. It will flatten it out. So just do it exactly how I'm doing it in the video, all the way around the perimeter. Then once you get to the side where you started, if you've used the pattern, your ends should line up. If they do not, if they are a little long, simply cut the green part a little bit so it just lines up perfectly from start to finish. You don't want any excess. If you don't have enough, you're going to use a whip stitch to kind of pull those pieces together. But once I have that completely sewn together, I'm going to come in with a whip stitch and sew those two green ends together just by coming through one side and out the other with a very clean little whip stitch. Very simple and easy to do. It just is a little finicky. But you do want to make sure to sew that close so nothing ends up falling out or it doesn't end up kind of falling apart on you. So blanket stitch around the edge to make sure that you get the top and the bottom, or the top and the side of the cucumber linked together, and then you're just going to whip stitch that side closed. Once you have that done, then you can go ahead and you've got this nice little almost boat, if you will. Has a side on it, has a bottom. You're going to place your little batting or your extra felt right inside. Then you're going to take your last piece of the cucumber and place it right on top. Then just like before, you're going to blanket stitch that to the side itself with the batting inside. This is going to create a little bit of bulk inside so it doesn't flatten out, and it's going to close everything together. When doing pieces like this, the reason I use the darker green thread is because with the darker, I feel like it blends into the lighter better than if I were to use a white thread all the way around, then you would really see it on the green. I just feel like it blends better. So whenever you're using your different floss colors, whatever looks better to your eye, use that. It's pretty much that simple. Once I have that completely sewn up, I am going to come in, make my knot to finish this off and kind of make sure that this isn't going to come unraveled. So just make a little stitch, thread it through and knot it. Then I am going to put my needle inside. It doesn't really matter. You just want to go close to where your last stitch was, not exactly where your last stitch was, but close. Put my needle inside. If I have any leftover floss that I feel like is too much, I'm going to go ahead and snip that off right now. So I just pull it through the eye of my needle, and I feel like I have a little bit too much here, so I'm just going to snip it a little shorter. Then I'm going to push my needle out through an opening. Doesn't matter where, just a good distance away. So then when I pull it through, my thread will drop inside and I can pull my needle out and all my ends are nice and tucked in. All right, pickle is done in exactly the same way. You've got two top and bottom. Then you have a side from a different color of green. So for the pickle, I use two different colors of green felt. I use the olive, and then that is for the top and the bottom. And then for the side of the pickle, I used Kelly green. For the inside, I did put in some batting. And then for the stitching, I used this dark green floss color. That stitching is not only to hold everything together, but also add those little stitching details of the seeds. Now the stitching itself is fairly simple. You just do a couple little lines, a couple little stitches in there to create those seeds. However, if that's not something you want to take the time to do, that's totally fine. You can use either a marker for this one or use a little fabric paint just to add those little details in. Again, really is up to you. But that pickle is done in exactly the same way as the cucumber. Next up, we have the onion. Onion is made exactly the same way, just using different felt colors and floss colors, of course. You've got your top and your bottom are from white felt. Your side is from purple pizzazz, and you're using a purple floss. Now, the thing with the onion is the stitching. This takes a while. You basically do a back stitch just to create these circles all the way around the onion. That does take some time. I did it on both sides. However, if that's not your thing, I want to show you what the fabric paint would look like. I thought this would be the perfect one to show it on just because this is so time consuming. I wanted to show you another option. But I do love the way the stitching on the onion looks. I think it's adorable. So what I have here is just some fabric paint. You can buy these individually at your local craft store, or you can buy them from Amazon. You can buy them in a pack from your craft store. But basically what I have here is just a purple fabric paint. The thing with fabric paint you want to remember is it does dry darker than it goes on. So here I have a really light purple. This is going to dry a little bit darker. So you might want to do a few color swatches with them if you are going to use them, just to make sure the final color is something that you'll be happy with. What I do though is basically start with a little dot in the center and then just make larger circles around it. Pretty simple and easy to do. It takes no time at all. If you find your tip's getting a little bit of paint on it, especially with these circles, just have a napkin close by where you can wipe it off. And I like to move my fabric and have my hand in a comfortable position. That way it goes on fairly easy. And here's what it looks like with the fabric paint. Then I just layer in some of that batting on the inside. I use 2 pieces here, and then I just stitch it together exactly like I did the cucumber and all the other ones with the blanket stitch. The tomato is made pretty much the same way. You just have another layer added into this one. So what you do is you first cut out 2 plain circles from red. Then you cut out 2 more plain circles from red. 2 of those circles, you are going to make these little cuts inside them. They're almost like little bean looking things that you're going to cut out from 2 of the circles. For these more intricate, smaller pieces, I do use a Sharpie to draw on the back side. With the Sharpie, especially a broad tip, you're going to get lines that are smaller than your actual pattern. So then I just cut right outside those Sharpie lines with my scissors. This just makes it a whole lot easier to cut out those intricate pieces than trying to do it with the pattern attached. And on this darker fabric, it is just a little bit easier for me to see. The tailor's chalk was a little bit too hard for me to see on this fabric. So I just used a Sharpie, did it on the back. It will be just fine. So I cut those out, and then I am going to use a little bit of glue just to hold these down while I do some stitching. I would suggest using glue here. You can pin these down, but I would suggest using a little bit of glue because when you put these down, you have these little openings, and I have stitched those down before with the whip stitch. However, it really flattens the tomato out, so I almost like to leave them unstitched. I think it gives a better look, but the glue is going to hold everything down and keep it to where those 2 pieces won't separate. So I like to use a little Fabri-Tac in there. Then with some yellow floss, I'm going to create little seeds in each one of those openings. This is a simple little stitch. You can do them wherever you want. You can do however many you want. Just create some little seeds in those openings. Again, if you don't want to do any stitching in there, you definitely don't have to. I just think it adds a little bit of detail. Then we're going to add batting to the inside, and we are going to start sewing just like we did before, using that back stitch, sewing our side to the top piece, making almost a little sandwich with the batting on the inside, and then sewing our final piece on, just like we did before. Now here on this sample piece, you can see I did whip stitch those openings down. It creates a really flat surface, so I would suggest just using the glue and leaving them unstitched. I think it gives a nice dimensional look to it. And as you're creating these pieces, create however many feels right to you, or however many you have time for. Some of these are more time consuming. You might want to only make 1 or 2. Some are a little bit more simple. You might want to make more. Use your best judgment and what you think your kiddo is going to like. Next up, we have the banana pepper. We're going to use our pattern to cut a longer strip of yellow felt. Then we're going to fold that strip over in half, and we're going to cut right there at the fold and make it into 2 pieces. By all means, you can leave it 1 piece and stitch it together at the center or at that fold. I find it easier just to give it a nice little snip and make two pieces, then essentially stitch them back together. It doesn't create as much bulk. Then with some yellow floss, I am going to just do a few stitches to both sides to hold the sides together. I like to go down and back a few times just because these are the only stitches holding this thing together. With this one also, I am just using one piece of felt. I don't find it necessary to use two pieces of felt for these. I did on the green pepper, but I almost think it makes it too rigid. So I wouldn't suggest it. Just use one piece of felt, stitch the two ends together, and then simply tie them off. Once I have them stitched together, you're essentially going to be left with just this kind of flat piece of felt with two ends that are tied together. What you want to do is take that piece and just turn it inside out, almost like you're turning a garment inside out. You're just going to kind of flip both sides over towards each other, open it up, flip them towards each other, and there you have your little banana pepper. Super, super simple. You can create a ton of these in no time at all. Here are just a few of them. Those ones that I am showing you, the older pieces, these have been around for a while, so they do hold up pretty well. The green pepper is made exactly the same way. Here you can see I did stitch two pieces together and you can see how rigid it is. Just use one piece. But with this one, you're going to stitch four of those pieces together. All of the ends together to make kind of this little square. And then you're just going to simply flip it over like you did the banana pepper and you'll have this cute little green pepper ready to go. As I'm making this pattern, I am not focused on what colors I am using in that moment, but when I go back and I look at this, I kind of look at how I can consolidate these colors and make this shopping list a little bit more simple. So as I made this green pepper, I decided to switch the colors I use to the Kelly green and the floss that you're already going to be buying for all those other pieces. Because if you used what I used here and you use this pirate green and use the floss, that's the only place you're going to use it is in these green peppers. By all means, if you want to do that, I've left them listed right here or on the video where you can go find them and buy them, have them to your shopping list. But if you already have the colors from beforehand, just use those. So there you have it, the sub sandwich felt food pattern. I am going to leave the free pattern linked down below in the description box. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I will get to them as soon as possible. Thanks for watching and happy crafting.